Hello, my name is Alain Sylvain. I'm here today to talk about sports, power, and Gen Z, what the world of sports reveals about the next generation of consumers. Just by way of introduction, I'm the CEO of a company called SYLVAIN. It's a strategy and design consultancy. We help companies think about the future of their brands and their products. We've been around for 11 years, certified B Corporation. You can check us out at sylvain.co. We work on a lot of different categories, a lot of different businesses. But I'm just going to jump ahead and tell the story. So I'm going to talk about generations. And even the idea of Gen Z is kind of a hilarious one because it's really about us as old people who are kind of obsessed by this mysterious and cryptic generation. And we try to decode them and we're from afar trying to understand them. And we know they're defined by their diversity and their kind of the fact that they're native to technology and so on. But what is history is showing us, or what modern history is showing us, is that Gen Z is going to shatter everything about the way business, culture, and society evolves. They are forcing a tidal wave of change that really no one ever saw coming, unlike any other generation. And one place where you see that really happening, and just by way of a sort of a petri dish to kind of look at this phenomenon, is the world of sport. Is the world of sports. I'm not a huge sports fan, but actually, if you look at sports, you'll see so much change happening. Whether you're talking about Juan Soto or Chloe Kim, or Pusilich in soccer, Buchers in basketball. The world of sport is changing dramatically because of these young, powerful players. It's interesting because as a population, Gen Z is actually not really watching live sports. 39% of Gen Zers never watch live sports. 20% of millennials never watch live sports. That's double as much lack of engagement when it comes to live sports. 64% of Gen Z teens watch short form video weekly. They're not watching long form stuff. They're looking for quick bites of content. And of course, they're cutting cords. They're not relying on traditional cable television relationships. 45% have cut the cord, or they're only streaming customers compared to 17% of their parents and baby boomers. Or here's more data. Among US NFL fans ages 18 to 34, 48% say they prefer watching highlights to full games, according to a survey by Variety. Among US NFL fans over 40, only 11% prefer watching highlights to full games. So this idea, it's a significant change. Young people want highlights, quick bursts of entertainment. Maybe it's not surprising, versus the older generation that really is happy to sit and watch a long form story. And also the definition of sports is changing. 80% say that the definition of sports is actually very different, and they're including things like gaming in that mix, where you wouldn't see that among older generations. So what we're seeing through the confluence of all these data points is this idea that Gen Z is sort of posing a big problem for the world of sport. If you work in live sports or sports media or professional sports, you're kind of freaked out by this new generation. They're not watching live sports, they're not engaging in the way, they're defining the sport differently. And this is sort of a metaphor for what we're seeing in other parts of society. And that's the thing to remember as we go throughout this whole story. And this is funny. It's not really true, actually. If you look, and my argument is that it's not really true. Sports have never waned in cultural significance due to generational shifts. Sports, you might say, is a living document as a society evolves. We evolve with sports in tandem. Sports is nothing but a kind of very visceral reflection of what society and culture is going through in a living moment, whether it's generations ago or now. But really, to tell the story, it begins with the Industrial Revolution. It goes all the way back to the mid-19th century when modern sports really was born. This notion of modern professional sports was born, and it has a lot to do with the availability of time. In the 1870s, the average worker in manufacturing clocked in about 62 hours of work per week, compared to 1920, where that number was just over 51 hours. So automatically, immediately, 10 hours of free time emerged, and people needed to fill that time. And it's through entertainment that happened, and particularly through sports. And so that window of time is actually when you saw the birth of baseball and basketball and football, the modern incarnations of American sport. And then, of course, by the 20th century, sports were part of everyday life. Newspapers dedicated to the sports pages were erected. You had stadiums that were being built. Groups were coming together. And by the 20th century, sports became sort of a modern cultural phenomenon in a way that we often don't realize. It's because it's so part of the fabric of society. So I want to tell the story of of this shift and how generations relate to sport using history. Okay, so it's our collective history through the lens of generations. And actually, even this notion of generations, that idea that people born between 1 year and another year are somehow monolithic. That's we all know that's probably not true, but in a generic sense, or rather, it is true from a generic sense, but not true necessarily specifically. And that's really what I want to go through here. And let's start, in the beginning of the 20th century with what's called the greatest generation. They're born in the beginning of 20th century. They really looked to radio for the kind of collective experience and the collective identity, and sports was really fed to them through radio. And all of a sudden they were tapped into new places. And a great example of that is KDKA in Pittsburgh that famously laid down cable in order to broadcast live the World Series between the Yankees and the Giants. And that for the first time you saw this kind of collective shared experience where you didn't need to be in the arena to really enjoy the sports experience. Or then that followed, right? That follows by the silent generation that were born into the Great Depression. And for them, it was really about TVs. And you saw mass-produced TVs for the first time. And one of the key inputs to television programming, television viewing, was live sports. So the silent generation grew up with the quiet hum of a game in the background coming from the television. In fact, television got off the ground because of sports. So says Harry Coyle, a TV director. Today, maybe sports need television to survive, but it was just the opposite when it just first started. When we put on the World Series in 1947, heavyweight fights, the Army-Navy football game, the sales of television sets just spurted. It was really sort of the accelerant for television consumption. Now, following that, you've got the baby boomers born 2 decades after the war, so 1946, 1964, and they really related to sports interestingly because that's where you saw the birth of the sports celebrity. And Muhammad Ali, of course, is iconic, but there are others. There's Broadway Joe, and people really got a sense of the full character of an athlete and the life that they had at home. Generation X, moving forward, people born in 65 to 1980 or so, really saw sports enter a bit more of a consumption phase where it was really about consumer behavior and consumerism. In fact, this famous spot from Apple actually, which we still talk about today in the world of brands and marketing, was broadcast during the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl began to be this sort of entree to consumer behavior, again, amplified by the power of celebrity, and who better to talk to about here than Michael Jordan, who brought Nike and Gatorade into the forefront. Millennials, shortly thereafter, kind of took this celebrity iconic status of athletes to a new level, and they started, through social media, developing real personal relationships with the athletes. And they became sort of beta testers for social media as a whole. And then you saw sports bleeding into pop culture in a really big way. People watch Super Bowl now really for the halftime show and for the excitement of that moment and that collective experience of that moment. And here's a great example. So in 2020, $96 billion was the size of the global sports equipment market size. So the people that were buying equipment to play sports versus 177 billion, virtually twice as much of sales tied to the apparel. So actually, sports is playing more of like a fashion role when it comes to consumption of equipment and apparel than it is actually about participation or playing sports. You don't have to look far to look at the world to notice this. You just got to look at the world of sneakers and kicks, which are absolutely somehow no longer only about function. They're now kind of iconic fashion symbols, whether you're an actor or a musician or a vice president. These sneakers are actually symbolic of more something to do with your personality and what you can do. You're on the go, you're active, and so on. So sports has sort of become ubiquitous with leisure and entertainment over those generations, as they've gotten more and more embedded into our entertainment diet, and they provide this deep biological primal rush of entertainment, and it kind of washes over us. And in a way, it provides this escape. There's this quote about working class, the environment, but it also applies to all environments. When you live around a working class environment, you see what sport means to people. You see that it's the escape over the weekend. You see how they build their lives around it. People sort of want to get away from their lives. And so sport has played this kind of escapist moment where people are in a way addicted to it. In a way, it just satiates life and provides a sense of catharsis and relief. So as such, some are allergic to when sports kind of rises to more of these kind of political moments. 71% express support for teams and athletes speaking out on issues of social justice and inequality. 71% express support for those athletes. But only 51% believed they should do so during a live event or during a sports event. That's a significant difference. You support it, but a lot of people are feeling, is this the right place for it? Don't get me wrong, like so many of us are in support of Colin Kaepernick and taking a knee and so on. But there is this kind of, even people who support that, there is this belief that is sports the place for it? Because they have this weird sort of addiction and this kind of hedonistic relationship with sports where really it's meant to be kind of the safe space where I can escape my shitty life, and it just makes me kind of imagine the future. But what makes Gen Z different and what we're seeing today is that sports is shifting from human pleasure to really being sort of the hotbed for human progress. Sports has always entertained, but it's also sort of the laboratory for human potential and what we can achieve as a society. And I don't need to tell you all the great examples of Jackie Robinson and Muhammad Ali, but the stories are all over the place. Some are not always talked about. This Magic Johnson, who came out as HIV positive in the 90s, really was the face of HIV in this country in a way that was tolerant for so many people that were homophobic and afraid to kind of confront the issue. Or you think about the baseball player Cutter, who negotiated an unbelievable deal. You never saw black athletes do that. And of course, the famous tennis match, the Battle of the Sexes with Billie Jean King, that was sort of a moment where society really expressed itself when it comes to progress. But all those moments that we know throughout history that we talk about so much are really sort of symbolic. The Battle of the Sexes tennis match was incredible, but it was an analogy. It was a reflection of something else. What is amazing about Gen Z is that they're shifting sport from kind of symbolic change to much more systemic change. Gen Z is inspired and active, and they believe that the world should change. Every corner of society change. If there's anything we can learn from Gen Z in the world of sport, is that they're off to hack the system and create change, whether you're talking about in government or in corporations. And what I'm going to talk about is the world of sport. 61% of Gen Z approve of anthem kneel protesting versus 37% of boomers who approve of anthem kneeling protesting. They do see a place for this, that the live arena is in fact the best place or one of the best places to express political change. But beyond just embracing it, they're actually doing something about it. They're not just observant. They're not passively watching sports. This is not escape for them. This is a tool. And I'm going to go through three ways that that's playing out. The first is sport evolving from pursuit of escapist pleasure to pursuit of purposeful progress. No longer is this kind of empty catharsis. And a good example of this is Overtime, this media network that launched, which basically is all about promoting and highlighting young athletes before they become corrupted by the sports industrial system. They're even creating a league for young athletes where they can actually get paid $100,000 a year and again, not have to fall into the NCAA trap or the NBA traps. And this is a great example of young people hacking the system, finding a way to really create some fundamental change. Naomi Osaka is such a great example of this. Before I'm an athlete, I'm a black woman. And as a black woman, I feel as though there are much more important matters at hand that need immediate attention rather than watching me play tennis. She famously decided not to play after the shooting of Jacob Lake. And she takes every opportunity to make her voice heard and draw attention to other parts of society using her platform. So that's one. Two is from competitive motivation to collective potential. So much of sport is extrinsic. This population really views that kind of its extrinsic nature a little differently. More than 2/5 of all Gen Z, 45%, cited they would rather support an athlete that gives to charity than is the best on the field. That's kind of perverted everything everyone knows, older people know about sport, where it's not about the person that scores the most or happens to be the most successful on the field. It's actually about what they're doing off the field. A lot of people criticize Michael Jordan in the 80s and 90s for being fairly silent, seemingly silent when it comes to social issues. Today, LeBron makes his political stance and his interest in social issues really front and center. And a lot of his fans are actually more so his fans for what he's doing off the court than what he can miraculously do on the court, which of course is on par with that of an MJ. Here's a good example. Okay, so a good example of change. So there's this guy named Matt Walzer who said this. I believe everyone, no matter what their physical, economic, or social circumstances may be, deserves to call themselves an athlete and deserves to have a sense of freedom and independence. What makes him interesting is that he has cerebral palsy. And he famously wrote a letter to Nike asking them to make a product for people like him where it doesn't involve some of those fine motor needs. And they developed this shoe that they're launching now. That's kind of incredible. Matt could do everything else. He's challenged when it comes to putting on his shoe, and he's an athlete. And so Nike went off and made this shoe. This isn't about Nike. Nike doesn't need credit for this. It's about Matt. And it's about this generation that really took this problem in their own hands. So here's three. From issue advocacy to entrepreneurial activism. Sports is sort of the hotbed, as a place where you're seeing the generation take control of issues that they care about. And let's just look at the world of women's sports for a second. Women make up 40% of all participants in sports, yet somehow receive only 4% of sports media coverage. It has a damning ripple effect. Without airtime, female athletes lose out on sponsors, fans, and coin. 4% of sports coverage. And there's more data. So by age 14, many girls are dropping out of sports at 2 times the rate of boys. Girls have 1.3 million fewer opportunities to play high school sports than boys have. So there's sort of a crisis in the world of women's sports at this young age. What's so cool is that you're seeing Gen Z hacking that, fixing that problem, addressing that problem. You know, one great example are these 4 athletes, Sue Bird and others, who came together and created a media network in something called Together. Gen Z Olympians created a place for these young women athletes to get airtime and coverage to really change that dynamic. Or you look at basketball players and climbers, Ashima Shirashi and Baluya Kamara, sorry if I'm butchering those names. They've written children's books for kids. Gen Z authors, athletes, wrote children's books for kids to better portray female athletes and the power of sport. So these are the things that sports teaches us when it comes to Gen Z. This is not about sports. This is about Gen Z. And these 3 key shifts apply to all corners of society. From pursuit of escapist pleasure to pursuit of purposeful progress, from competitive motivation to collective potential, from issue advocacy to entrepreneurial activism. And to me, this takes me back, makes me think of the high jump. You know, people were running at a bar to do the high jump in one way for generations. You know, you ran forward and you jumped forward until famously in 1968, when Dick Fosbury did this. He ran at the bar and then turned around and jumped backwards. And that's literally how the high jump's been done ever since. Gen Z, in the same way, is changing sports. We've been doing it one way, and they're going about changing sport to be much more purposeful, much more meaningful, much more political. So that's what we can learn from Gen Z. My name is Alain. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of Collision.